Hello, friends. Thank you for joining me. My name is Nnamdi Nnake, and I host Nationhood Podcast. Today, I'm excited to present the second edition of Conversations, where we bring historical perspectives to current issues. Our guest is Ozinna Ntukogu, a lecturer of history and war studies at the Nigerian Defense Academy and a doctoral researcher at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. Mr. Ntukogu's work examines African and African American history with a primary interest in colonial military history. Amongst other things, Ozinna is systematically analyzing the British conquest of southern Nigeria in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. In today's episode, we will be discussing warfare in Nigeria and bringing historical perspectives to this phenomenon from political, economic, and socio-cultural perspectives. And so, without further ado, I am honored to welcome Ozinna Ntukogu to Nationhood Podcast. Ozinna, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much. I am so excited to be here today. It's a great honor. And I also thank you, Nnamdi, for what you are doing. It's really good. I like the fact that you have this platform to educate the people, to get the people to know about, historical significance and the events that have happened over time. I am really happy for what you are doing, and I thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Very kind words. I appreciate that. And thank you for accepting to grace the podcast. I'm really excited to hear you share insights from your research and also your knowledge of military history in Nigeria and warfare more generally. I believe that listeners will be enlightened by this conversation. So I would like to start with the thing that fascinates me the most about your background as a historian and researcher. So please, tell us about your experience as a military historian. I know your interests go beyond the institution of the military itself, and it includes things like defense, security, strategic, and social history. The question then is, why have you chosen this area of research? What is so interesting about it?
Okay, yeah. Well, you see, most historians in Nigeria, especially historians from my own period, when we started the journey as undergraduates, most of us really, some of us, I would say, not most, did not expect, to get into history. Many of us applied to study law, and we found ourselves in history. And very interestingly, when you look at history from a very far distance, it looks really gloomy and very uninteresting because people have this mindset about history being all about dates and, talking about dead people and whatever. And when I got into the program, I found history to be so interesting. I understood why it is a discipline because it changes the way you think, it changes the way you understand things, and it changes the way you make judgments about things. So it became very interesting for me, and I made some kind of decisions not to leave history at the end of the day. So because many of us joined and we were like, yeah, we're going to leave after second year and we have to switch to law and the rest, So some of us did, and but many of us decided to stay back. So that was how I found myself in history in the first place. So I went to the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, and after my first degree, I decided to go for my master's. But I wanted to do something different, like something not really so popular in Nigeria in terms of different aspects of history. So I thought about military history. A friend of mine also spoke to me about that, and I was asking him the school he thinks I can do that, and then he suggested the Defense Academy. So I had to go to Defense Academy, and um, thankfully enough, it also coincided with my job offer in the Defense Academy as well. So I had to go there to study military history and also started my career as a budding historian. So, I was supervised by Dr. Udabola Lawrence, my co-supervisor. He's late now, late Professor Sakwe. Both of them did very wonderful job in training me as a budding historian, and I researched into the Nigerian Civil War for my thesis, and that was how my training as a military historian started. So after that, I continued in that same field, and I decided to also apply to the University of Calgary because of one of the leading historians, African military historians that we have in the Department of History in the University of Calgary in Canada here. So luckily enough, I got in as well, and I started my PhD there. So it has really been an interesting field for me because when we talk about war in history, it seems people really don't understand that war isn't what it seems to be, the way it sounds. Somehow, sometimes we treat it as very unimportant. We feel it's just like a different aspect of the society, a different aspect of life. It's not part of actually what we're doing, not part of the main thing we do. But if you look at it very closely, you will begin to ask yourself, why is it that whenever we talk about the origins of society, we begin with wars, right? The first thing you hear is, yeah, this particular group migrated, fought with these people, and then they were able to displace these people, and they took over, and wars have done this. You look at the history of the world generally, every major change that you will find always has war behind it. Every major change in the world. If you look at the major world wars that we have fought in this world, you will see that they brought a lot of changes. And you can't just discuss anything without talking about war. And that is why, we need to start thinking about war differently. Stop seeing war as not being part of life. You see a lot of changes that have happened because of war. So, and getting into military history made me to realize this. You now begin to see that war is studied as if it's not part of the society, but it is almost like the society itself. It's just like the question of the chicken and the egg. Which one produces which one? Is it the egg that produces the chicken or the chicken produces the egg? So it's just basically about war. The society, the war produces this society. Somehow the society makes the war as well. So you find out that it is so interwoven. So it's really interesting to get into military history, and yeah, I'm enjoying the field, of course, even though it's very tedious, to work in, but it's fine.
I can only imagine, and you touch on a lot of topics. For example, I can see the importance of this personal angle. For you, you are not just a lecturer of history at the Nigerian Defense Academy, but you also studied your part of your historical training happened there as well. You got your MA from that
Yeah.
institution, so one can get a good sense of why you are steeped in military history. And I like how you were just now posing that question, if it is societies that make war or if it is war that makes society. As a matter of fact, there's a question I'm hoping to ask you along the line that, addresses this issue. But let me just dwell a bit more on your background before we move on. What is it like to teach history to soldiers, and why is it so important that they are familiar with it? Does it play any role in the work they do? Because we tend to think about soldiers as people who are going to go out there and shoot guns or unfortunately get shot. Why is it important that they learn about history? And if you think it is important, can you maybe illustrate with any examples or scenarios that can help to highlight this very well?
Yeah, it's really interesting. This question is still the same question that is posed generally in all fields. People have asked that question about what is the relevance of history, what is the importance of history, not just even in the military, but in all ramifications. And I would always say that at the end of the day, history, it's not just like medicine and surgery. You study that, you are going to work in the hospital, you are going to treat people, you are going to have patients around, and this. It's basically about way of thought, right? It's about the way of thinking, and that is why you find that history, when people study history, they can move into all aspects of life. It's about bringing that historical way of thought, of thinking into whatever you do. So when you come to teaching history to cadets or military cadets, as the case may be, you find out that most of the trainings that cadets get is all about historical antecedents. Whatever they are being taught is about wars that have happened in the past, military operations that have happened in the past. And it is the same experiences, all those experiences that are used to, instruct these cadets, to teach them how to survive if they find themselves in a similar situation. And that is history. It is nothing else but history. So if you look at military leadership over the years and we begin to ask, why did this leader fail? Why did this leader succeed? It's all about to look at what they have done in the past, where they got it wrong and where they got it right. And that is basically what military history is all about. Look at what has happened in different conflicts in the past. What are the lessons we can learn from these conflicts? How do we move on from here? Even in terms of all the military revolutions that have happened in the military aspect of life, weapons, communications, troop management. It is all from the historical antecedents that we move ahead. And if we look at weapons that have been developed, you say, oh, okay, these weapons were used in these places and they had these problems because of so and so factors. That means if we are moving into this area again, it means we can't use this kind of weapon because we are still going to face the same kind of challenges. So you find out that it is really, really important for military cadets to have a sense of history in whatever they are doing. It also fosters that sense of um, nationalism in cadets as well because they need that that sense of nationalism which will foster their patriotism to their country. They really, really need that for them to continue to strive in that field, which is filled with risks. It's no joke, if you keep listening to what is happening right now in the country about the different kinds of insurgencies that we have, you see that military personnel have been the targets all the while, right? So you go to the academy, you study history, you study different tactics and strategies that you use in the main battlefield when you are fighting conventional warfare. And after you graduate, you come out and you meet unconventional warfare, you meet, guerrilla warfare, and you get very confused. So at the end of the day, the only thing that you still use to change that curriculum at the end of the day is the same history. How have nations fought guerrilla warfare, insurgencies in the past? And the same documents are, or training doctrines and manuals are what we are going to use to train our own cadets and make them, really learn about the current trends and how to maneuver their ways in the new forms of warfare that we have today. So it is really important to teach cadets history. And if you come to the Defense Academy, there are different departments as well, just like we have history and war studies, and they specialize basically in history of warfare and even about the ethics of war. It is also really important to these because basically these guys are going to be officers and it's not just they are commanders, right? It's not just the ordinary troops that are following. They are supposed to give orders. They are supposed to lead these troops. They are supposed to know how to manage these men. When we talk about these movements, it's really very simple and easy in the eyes. But when you have 2,000 soldiers to manage, that is when you understand how difficult such a task is. You have to make sure these people don't get angry at you, they don't mutiny, they don't have this low morale. They have to be very ready to fight at every point in time. They have to be ready to give their life, to lay down their life. And it all lies on leadership. So these leaders, the cadets, I mean, if you don't train them well, if they don't have that sense of how to lead, if it is a very catastrophic thing for the military as an institution in general. So it is really important for you to have here cadets learning history. In terms of the teaching, it has been an honor, very, very, very interesting to teach these guys. It's it's a different kind of environment where everything is really very regimental. You have to be in class by this time. You have to do this. You have to do that, and you have to make your orders very specific. So almost like you are also part of the military because in most cases they have been trained to take to orders like it's not like an appeal. You must make those orders and give those orders and make sure that they take to those orders. So it's a different kind of teaching for them. So you have to be very kind of uh, regimental as well for them to uh, understand what you're trying to say. So you do everything possible to get them along. It's unlike the conventional universities where you can make these people understand without giving those kind of strict orders and the rest. So that's it.
Quite understandable. Thanks for shedding light. I'm going to move quickly into nationalism, but can you just quickly clarify for us what it means or the difference between the soldiers and officers? Because I heard you mention that cadets have to go through this training. If I understood you correctly, these are people who would eventually become officers. But is the same historical training available to non-commissioned officers, to soldiers who are not officers?
Well, this same training, the thing is, if you begin to go into that, it's just like two different cadres, right? So for the cadets who are going to become officers, I wouldn't want to dwell much on that because it's going to take our time. But we have just two streams that you can go into, either as a direct, short service stream, or you can come in as a regular officer. You go through the Defense Academy and spend 5 years, right? So you do 4 years of academic training and then 1 year of military training all through, and then you come out and get commissioned as an officer. So it is in this process that these cadets get these trainings, these academic trainings. But for the other ranks cadre, these guys have like about 6 to 9 months of training, so it really doesn't give that space for that academic training. But in as much as it is that way, many of these other ranks as well, when they get into service, they begin to go for different courses, and in these courses they also begin to integrate some of these things in them, even teaching them the ethics of war, issues of nationalism and rules of war, and issues of what you don't do in war. Because just like we have said, these guys are the backbone because they are more in number, right? So you may have 10 officers and you have 10,000 soldiers, you know. So you have more people on the part of the other ranks cadre than in the officer cadre. So that's it. But they also get some aspect of this training, but not in the academy. The academy is strictly for the officer corps, right? Then the other ranks they train in their depot. For now we have one in Kaduna, in Zaria. So you can always have. They also go into these trainings, but when they have gotten into the army, then they begin to go for different courses and they begin to also train them in terms of nationalism and ethics of war and the rest. So that's it.
Thank you very much for clarifying that. I think that was a very important clarification that you provided. One of
Yeah.
the things I was hoping to achieve with that is to help people to understand that our soldiers are not necessarily just automatons or machines that are told go and they go. I mean, and even songs have been sung about a soldier come, soldier go. And even though we get to see that, maybe even from the officer call to the non-commissioned officers, I think you've done a good job of highlighting how there's a broad range of training that is available either in the academy or at the depots and even throughout the course of their service. And one of the
Yeah.
things I really like that you pointed out is the role of history, the kind of historical training they get on things like the ethics of war, and
Mm-hmm.
how all of that builds up into helping to foster a sense of nationalism in our
Yeah.
soldiers, which is one of the core objectives of Nationhood Podcast. So, one of the things I wanted to explore now is how this concept of nationalism is linked with the military and warfare. Because when people speak of nation building, the military is usually not what comes to mind. Even though you started earlier by pointing out the importance of war and warfare to the origins of literally any nation. Most
Yeah.
nations we can think about today, anywhere in the world, have some kind of warfare at the beginning of their existence. They either came about through warfare, or sometimes in the early stages, they fight some kind of warfare after they've been created. It's
Yeah.
a very common theme.
Mm-hmm.
But even with that, people don't tend to think about the military when they think about warfare, when they think about nation building, excuse me, is what I was trying to say. And
Yeah.
if we think about African countries, it may be the case that we don't associate the military or warfare with nation building, because the institution of colonialism was upheld by military power, and it was seen as an oppressive system. And even in the post-colonial era, the dictatorships that became common across much of Africa have relied on similar structures to guarantee their position in power. So in a place like Nigeria, for instance, many people fear rather than love the military because it's associated with oppression. In the colonial era, those soldiers of the colonial institution were used to suppress the people. And even in the post-colonial era, the Nigerians who came to power would also frequently revert to the military for suppression of, the people. And if you think about it, recently in Delta State, the military institution came under attack. You mentioned how the military is frequently attacked. So there is a kind of disconnect between what it means to be a nation, a sense of nationalism, and the military are a big symbol of what it means to be a nation, ordinarily. So, question for you is, in your opinion, how central is the military to the concept of nationhood, and how should Nigerians begin to view the military? What can our history tell us, really?
Yeah. The question of nationalism and the military, like you have said correctly, is really just very obvious, because we know that the military, military service on its own is the highest level of nationalist service you can give, right? Because you are paying the supreme service, you are going to lay down your life for the good of your country. But then, just like you have rightly mentioned, the foundation of most African militaries have been seen as kind of faulty because of the way the colonial authorities founded our militaries. Just like we have mentioned rightly, using these military institutions to uphold colonial authorities and their power, subduing the people, getting the people to do the wish of these colonial authorities, and leaving the country as well. You find the countries continuing with this kind of trend again, where people see the military as, that instrument of oppression and brutality, which needs to change seriously, because it's one thing with perception is that once it sticks, it gets so difficult for you to eradicate that. Well, one truth that we should look at in the case of Nigeria is that, yes, we have had a lot of military rule, right? And after that, we have now transited into civilian rule. But you ask, why is it that during the military rule, we had a lot of, you know, um, institutions that were built that have continued to foster our unity today as a nation? Even in the country right now, the military as an institution as well remains one of the strongest pillars of nationalism and unity in the country, because that is where you get to and you still find, you know, all the ethnic groups fully represented, and you find their presence in all parts of the nation, no matter where that part is, even in the remotest parts of the country. It seems the military, even right now, is like the only sense of security that the people have. The moment the military is around, everybody feels secure, right? even on the highways, and military has been deployed even in internal security in the country, not just about securing the territorial boundaries. It is now everywhere, so, and that is the only way Nigerians still feel secure. And I think the Nigerian military has been doing a lot in terms of this building nationalism. In as much as, yes, there has been the bad eggs, right, in the military, who may have made use of their powers wrongly, brutalizing civilians, which have given the military that kind of perception. Even when you see skit makers making skits, the perception that they give the military is, yeah, well, they just see you, they begin to beat you. If you do anything wrong, they brutalize you, they make you roll on the floor, on the ground, and make you do this. So, but basically, it's not as if that's what the military does, right? So, but that image has been created already. But it's not what really happens, because the people just need to get educated to understand the role of the military in the society. And the military has been doing a lot. That's why I told you that the course, different courses that have been going on, even for these other ranks, has been helping, because it has been helping a lot of them to understand their role in the society. That your role is not actually to subdue and subjugate the civilians, but actually protect them. So if you notice the trend now, I think it is beginning to change. The narrative is beginning to change. Even what happened in Delta, a lot of people were expecting that the military was going to burn everywhere, kill people, do this, do that. But that narrative is not, it is not business as usual, what it used to be, like the way people see the military as an instrument of oppression and destruction and chaos and what have you. Yes, the military, these guys are trained for war, right? So at every point in time you call them in, it may not end as you may have thought. That is why I think the authorities are beginning to really, get very careful in how they use the military, and also the kind of trainings that are also given, because we have seen that at the end of the day, the world is no longer in that stage of interstate conflict as much. We still have that, but it's no longer as prominent as it used to be. Right now, it is mostly internal issues that we have. So the military is no longer trained in that sense of go into that country, destroy, demolish, kill everyone and the rest. So because you're now dealing with your people, right? So you can't continue with that destruction and demolition. So the kind of trainings that are also given to them are also that kind of trainings that will help them in terms of controlling riots and trying to bring down some kind of civil unrest, and also some internal security services that they can provide. So basically, I think the military has been doing a lot in terms of fostering this nationalism and that's unity in the country, and they have embodied that uh, uh, image of unity and nationalism in the country. In as much as we have had, like I said before, we have had some kind of breakdown between the military and the civil institutions, which it's bound to happen sometimes, but it's really under control. That from time to time you get these guys trained and retrained, and they begin to understand that this is how to handle things and all this. So, but it's basically a problem of colonial establishment and that doctrine of using the military to subdue. It has been there, haunting this institution, but there has been serious input from both the military and the civil authorities as well to make sure that that's kind of we decolonize, because you see everybody's talking about decolonialism, that we decolonize all institutions including the military as well. So that's it.
Very, very important point you make there. I think you really hit, the nail on the head. And I like how you made reference to the incident in Delta. For those of us who are old enough to have read about or even visited places like OD in Bielsa, or who have friends there, we might remember very well what happened after a similar incident as to what happened in Delta occurred when the military moved in and literally wiped out, much of that community in terms of people. Lots of youths were unfortunately killed, people who were innocent, and regardless of whatever input they may have had in that incident, it was clearly unfortunate that people who were innocent got, caught up in that whole crossfire or in the post, um, after the event when the military were trying to clean up what had happened
Mm.
there. And so there was that fear in Delta that a similar thing would happen. As a matter of fact, I read an article yesterday about the elders in Okwama community there in Delta complaining about not being able to find certain persons, members of their community who had run away when they were afraid of what the military would do. And
Yeah.
so even though these complaints are there and definitely need to be looked into, I certainly agree with you that whatever may have happened has not happened on the scale with which we are familiar. And so maybe the kind of trainings you're talking about are really beginning to take root. I remember no long after the incident in Delta, Professor Chidi Odinkalu, who used to head the human rights watchdog in Nigeria, wrote an article trying to trace the colonial roots of how our military has always been used to, if you like, destroy communities that attack the military. And he was talking about an event that happened in Satiru, which is just about maybe 20 kilometers or so south of Sokoto, where the British resident at the time was killed in a kind of local rebellion. And so Lugard shipped his soldiers down there and they wiped out that village, and even till today, that village does not exist. So it was completely destroyed. Yeah, and the point he was trying to make is that the military institution has continued that tradition till date, where rather than trying to be very specific in their methods of, creating justice or at least establishing the rule of law, they just come and use a hammer to kill every single fly that is in sight. But I like this point you make about how there is constant training and re-education to improve the perception of the military in the public and in the
Yeah.
eye of Nigerians. So great points there. I'd like to ask, given the centrality of warfare and conquest to human societies, I know that we can talk about warfare in Nigeria going back as many centuries as possible. So if we look at the 19th century, for instance, one could talk about Danfodio's jihad that started at the beginning of the 19th century and established the Sokoto Caliphate and Islamic religion across much of northern Nigeria. Or if we come towards the end of the 19th century, we can talk about the Ekiti-Parappa War or the Kiriji War, which was between Yoruba kingdoms and signaled the end, of the Oyo Empire when different former um, nations under Oyo Empire were now trying to establish themselves as the predominant nation, people like the Ibadan, the Jeshas, and what have you. And then there are also linkages that have been made between the jihad of Danfodio and the Ekiti-Parappa War, such as conversations about the struggles in the Ilorin, where it ultimately became an Islamic emirate, even though it is predominantly populated by the Yorubas. So clearly, there is so much to explore in our history of warfare, and we can even go further back as the history goes. But I'd like us to pay some attention to the colonial wars of conquest in southern Nigeria, which I know forms part of the core of your research. I'm aware that as of 1905, the British had conquered most of northern Nigeria and some major locations in the south, even places like Benin in the late 19th century. But in the early 20th century, some warfare was still going on. So, what were the major locations of resistance to British rule in this period, in the early 20th century, and how did the British go about subjugating these places?
Okay, yeah. Just like we have said initially, societies have always been created by wars, and societies themselves have always made wars. And these wars have always created a lot of changes that we look at the society today, we don't even understand that many of these changes are products of wars. And whenever wars are mentioned, people are like, yeah, it's something that doesn't exist. It exists somewhere, but not here. But you don't even know that it's a constant interaction that the war has always had with the society. So now, moving away from, the uh, different Nigerian societies and ethnic groups and groups or states or whatever we may call them have always, engaged in wars, like you have said. We have always had wars in different parts of Nigeria. Even the coastal areas have always also even fought their own wars, what we may also call their own naval warfare as well. And you find people in northern Nigeria, fighting their own wars and trying to establish one or two states and the rest before even the jihad of Uthman Fodio in 1804, and also the rise and fall of Oyo Empire, and also the rise of Ibadan and the rest. These are products of wars, changes brought by wars. Sokoto Caliphate was also established by warfare, but many of these things are not even recognized. Whenever we talk about the establishment of these things, sometimes we don't look at the war. Even Benin, that you have also mentioned as well, Benin Kingdom itself, even its own rise and fall and all that, also are centered around wars. There have been succession wars, succession rights wars that happened between the different uh, heads of the Benin Kingdom, and these wars are somehow not very treated in history. And then coming to the establishment of colonial rule in Nigeria, which brought a different kind of warfare to the people, because it is really interesting how the British was able to conquer and subdue the different peoples of Nigeria. In northern Nigeria, they were able to do that. They moved down to the south as well, probably through surely through the coastal areas, and they were able to also subdue the southern peoples. And people will keep asking, like, sometimes you also find people sometimes saying, yeah, the people were able to fight and resist and do this and do that. And some people would even say, yeah, the people could not fight, they couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. But it is really interesting when you look at, what really happened between the people and the British. You find out that the people, the local peoples of Nigeria have always been in contact with the British. They were friends at first, right? And they traded with them. They brought in lots of weapons and gave to the people because they wanted them to continue to fight their internal wars and continue to capture slaves and sell to them, that's to the British. And at the point, the British then realized that, yeah, I think we have to um, get these guys down because there is no longer slave trade. So we have to change. Now we are talking about legitimate trade. Now we have to get these guys to give us the oil and whatever. But then the middleman was a problem, and not just that, the rise of looking for colonies that was going on in Europe. Everybody wanted to have colonies because of imperialism. Now these guys decided to change what they were doing. At the end of the day, they didn't want to give you those guns now that were you know, that had modern, as at the time, those modern features. At the end of the day, most of these people still, the local peoples of Nigeria had the older guns, right? And these guys came in with the newer ones. But the most interesting thing is that when we talk about British expeditionary forces or the forces that conquered the country, most of us still don't realize that actually Africans were conquered by Africans themselves, not actually the British, because majority of the people who carried guns, who fought these wars of conquest, like subduing Africans, were Africans themselves. Because these guys, they came in, made sure they recruited soldiers from our people, and they will make sure they get people from if their aim is to attack, just like the Arrow expedition in southeastern Nigeria, which is the most popular, they will make sure they get your neighbors, as their spies and as well as people who will guide them, their porters and everything. And they make sure these people will lead them direct to the heart of the town because Europeans themselves don't know the hinterland that much. So it's actually our own African brothers who did the main job, the conquest themselves. So,
So just a quick intervention. I'm sorry to
yeah,
just
yeah,
butt in, but I'm wondering if there's a parallel that we can draw between what you've just described, where Africans were like the foot soldiers and Europeans were maybe the officers, and the
yeah,
current system where we have the non-commissioned officers and the
Yeah.
officers in the military? Is there any kind of like parallel that can be drawn between both? And then you
Of
can also
course,
continue with what we're talking about. Yeah.
of course, that is the organization of the military, right? And that is where we got the whole other ranks and officer stuff from. It has been the European style of the military, and they brought it and then established it for us. When they started recruiting these people, they were not recruiting Africans as officers; they were recruiting them as other ranks, right? So, and you find the same pattern, the same organization now replicated after the conquest itself, because as at the time they had these careers, they had people who were cooking, because war is really a very large business. It's a very it's we only think about the shooting, right, and the killing. We don't understand that people who are shooting must eat. These people will need to wear clothes. These people will need to find somewhere to sleep. These people will have a lot of things that should be done, and they must be done by people. So the European style was that style that brought all these. Today in the military, we have them as corps. Like you now have corps that are specialized in intelligence, right? These guys will have to provide the intelligence that will be used by the infantry that will move in. And then you have the artillery force, the artillery unit who will still shell the opponents and their positions and whatever. Then you still have other corps like supply and transport, right? So these different aspects, which were unknown, like not as if totally unknown, but they were not organized in the way the Europeans organized them as at the time. But Africans who were, functioning in these kind of lines did not know themselves as supply and transport personnel, or know themselves as intelligence personnel, but they found themselves being used as spies. They will ask them to go and know what is happening in the next community. They come back, they tell the Europeans and whatever. So many of them were used in that light, and this whole issue of intelligence gathering that we still have is a very big issue up to date, was basically what was used against Africans, making use of these guys, get them to understand what they are. Remember, even before this time, we've had missionaries coming in, trying to also talk to the people, get the people to accept Christianity, and you also have um, many people combating, somehow accepting these guys. So, but when it came to the same conquest, and they also saw their brothers as well coming in to ask questions, they never felt they were threats, and they volunteered some kind of information to them, and they would go back to tell the Europeans. So basically, you see the same, for your question, you see the same institution of other ranks officer stuff. So, and that was why even when they were leaving, they had to, commission some of these people, some of the other ranks as well as officers, to continue the military institution. And as at that time, they had also trained some officers as well before leaving. So, but the whole conquest in southern Nigeria is really the whole of Nigeria, in fact, not just even Africa as a whole. You find the natives themselves, the locals, doing most of the job than the Europeans, and that was just it, and that's it. Yeah.
Thank you. There are two things that pop out, of what you've just described. I'm hoping maybe you can shed a bit more light on areas in southern Nigeria that many people are not too familiar with, but were major centers of resistance to British rule. You already mentioned Aro, the conquest of Aro, which was very popular. I know the Aro deity was a kind of central um, central figure around which the people in this area mobilized their beliefs and thought would give them the backbone to fight against the British rule. Of course, they were conquered by guns. But are there any other parts of southern Nigeria where some major military conquest happened, where they had to deploy their forces to go and defeat any kind of resistance that were being put up by the locals in this early 20th century?
Yeah, there are many of them. The only problem that we have with locating or having enough information about them. Is all about issue of records and keeping those historical records about what happened, right? And that is what historians do. And then military historians come in at this point, which is why I got interested in what really happened in terms of military administration of southern Nigeria, because there were many people who rose, and there were many patrols. You keep hearing of patrols that were sent to different places about one problem or the other, and the military went there, and they will just do what they had to do, sometimes kill some people, arrest some people, but just take care of the situation, and then they move out again. So there were many uprisings, which we can't begin to, pinpoint at this point. There were some in Udi, in some Ogu areas, in some parts of Anambra. There is even an expedition that is called Onitsha Hinterland Expedition. That expedition, which I have come across in different books, have not actually been, discussed very well. Even in different parts of Abakaliki areas, right? You find some of these expeditions that happened there because the people resisted very well. So the British had to plan very well, deploy a lot of resources before they were able to subdue the people there. Because the thing is, most Africans and most Nigerians, in the sense of today's Nigeria, the local peoples as at the time, some of them really did not understand what was happening, when the British came in with the whole colonial agenda. They did not understand what was happening. They felt these guys were going to stay and do their business, and when they are done, they are going to leave. So they didn't understand the fact that these people had come to govern them. So it was only when they realized that many of them started fighting. So that's why in some places, you find people who resisted from the time they came in, right? They would stop the British, try to stop them at that point, and you will find some people who wouldn't even do anything at the time they came in. It's now after the administration had been established, like you have the court system and all those things. You now see the people understanding that these guys are here to control our lives. They are now telling us when to trade. They are coming into our disputes, land disputes, and telling us that this person should take the land or this. That's when the people now understand that, yeah, this is now outright control that these guys have come for, and then they rise up. And then the next thing is a patrol is sent, or an expeditionary force is sent to bring down these guys. And that's when, that's why it's as if some people would say, some people never fought the British, they just accepted. That acceptance should also be looked at somehow, because it's not basically because these people knew what was happening and then said, yeah, we have accepted you. It's just that some of them, just the same thing that happened even with the issue of Christianity. Some people felt uh, if they want land, we give them areas that we're not using. They should go there and do their thing. They never believed the church was going to get converts amongst the people. And before you knew what was happening, people started going to church, became converts, and a lot. So people didn't understand the kind of um, force that the Europeans would muster at the end. They never expected that, and that was just like what happened in the coastal areas as well. These guys felt, oh, we have been trading with the Europeans for a long time. They are not gonna hurt us. They are just our friends. They have been trading based on our own terms. They were so surprised when they started seeing gunboats coming to the coast and shooting these communities and uprooting their traditional heads and doing all sorts of things. So it was came like a shock, So, but at the end of the day, these military expeditions eventually came, and some people resisted, some people did not. But these expeditions in southern Nigeria are actually going to be the focus of my research, because there are a lot of them which have not been looked at. Why those expeditions happened and what really happened after that. Because just like in our expedition as well, the people who also did research in that area, they really tried, because when you read some of those expeditions, people are just interested in mostly what happened, how these guys came in, shot people, and then left. But there were also trials that happened after that expedition, and people were hanged. And it was really, it is something that we will look at with some kind of an appalling perception, because these people were fighting to defend their lands, and you established a court and tried them, like a military tribunal, tried these men and said they were colluding against colonial authorities, and you hanged these people in the market squares and called the communities to come and look and all those things. There are a lot of atrocities that were committed by the Europeans, which are not really emphasized the way that they should be emphasized. So when we talk about our expedition, we only look at those aspects of shooting and people running, and that's it. So, but what of the trials that happened after the whole period of shooting and taking over and the occupation and the rest? So, what happened after? Those aspects are not really emphasized, and they really mean a lot, because that was when they eliminated the traditional heads, even those people who led the Arab forces, those brave men, those heroes that the people recognized and identified with. That was the time they wiped all of them out. It's really not something interesting to think about, but it is important that we know about these things, and that is why that military history and history in general is really important for us to look at these expeditions, and the resistance that people put up, and how the British handled this resistance, and what they did to the people and what they did not do, and that is the thing.
You really make a lot of good points about the sociocultural interconnections of warfare with life, especially in a colonial situation, which one may think about as a kind of oppressed and oppressor circumstance. But
Yeah.
I also like how you underscore the fact that there was some form of interchange and relationship between the British and local people. It wasn't necessarily always something that started with war and conquest, but
Mm-hmm.
sometimes it was a function of a change in the framework. So,
Yeah.
one of the things that comes to mind listening to you speak is some literature I read in 1918 when the First World War was being wrapped up, and the colonial government in Nigeria tried to introduce direct taxation in the South, which had not been a thing. Taxation was common in the North, and they were trying to introduce that in the South. And the people in Egba territory revolted against that idea of introducing taxation, which prompted Lugard to send military forces there to go and conquer. Well, maybe conquer may not be the word, but at least pacify the region.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a kind of expedition. And the soldiers he was sending, the soldiers he sent to go and do this job were mostly people who had just come back from East Africa in what would be today's Tanzania. They were the ones sent down to go and try to pacify Egbaland, So it just crossed my mind as you were speaking about how it wasn't necessarily always about um, antagonism, but something may have changed in the way the British were, controlling their area, which in this case made the Egba to say, no, why do you want to start taxing us? And they
Mm-hmm.
revolted. So thank you for clarifying that. The other thing I was going to ask in relation to the point you had made earlier is how did people see, or would you know how locals generally saw the role of those involved in the military with the British? Did they look at them as sellouts, or was there, have you found instances where people, even maybe at a community level, actively participated in supporting the military, activities of the British? Like, what was in it for them if you found people who were participating? For example, did they think it was better to be under British rule? Are there any examples you can illustrate with?
Well, if you look at the colonial structure itself, like it was the colonial experience for Africans or for Nigerians as we may have it today. It was a total change of lifestyle, which affected all aspects of living, everything the people knew as life. had to be affected. You see, the people who had known some kind of local industries and trade and all aspects of economy about agriculture and, you know, livestock keeping, fishing, hunting, and different kinds of economies, and also in terms of trade, adding slaves to it as articles of trade. And they had different ways of trading and even their currencies and different kinds of market system. And all of a sudden, everything changes. Some people come in with guns and tell you that you have to make use of this kind of money, you have to trade this particular product, you have to do this, you have to do that. It ties directly to everything, including the military. So, as at the time, these people came in with this colonial system and introduced this system of wage labor, right? You get your pay after you work. That was actually the draw for some people because at the end of the day, it's just like you are now the modern guys, kind of, because you just like you when I watched some part of your this thing when you talked about the railway and the rest, a lot of people had to move into this service because at the end of the day, this is what is trending now. A lot of things that we have been doing have been abandoned, like they are living that kind of life gradually. So the military was somehow what was being seen as an alternative to other aspects of life. You get there because they were paying these guys, they were paying the people they were recruiting. Coming back to your question about how the people saw them, of course, the people saw these guys not in good light. They felt these guys were traitors, kind of like colluding with the Europeans to come beat us up and kill us all and do all sorts of things. In fact, it was that same view that was kind of given birth to at that early colonial stage that was transported even into the colonial period, the way they were seeing, the court clerks as at then, because they saw them as outright enemies of the people. These guys would just come and arrest you and take you to court and do all sorts of things. That's the same way they saw these military guys who were working with the military, with the colonial authorities and the rest. So most of them who colluded with the Europeans were seen in that light. And somehow it continued that way even into the main colonial period, even during the when the colonial rule has been established very well. So that kind of understanding about these people continued to be there. That in fact, when you listen to some people, they will tell you that a mother who has given birth to a soldier has no child, right? So even when the Europeans brought education, the Western education system, the people still saw it as just like a sector for people who had no future, kind of, because it was different from what the people used to know. And you just tell people to go to school and sit down in class and learn what they don't understand. So for them, it was just a waste of time. People who were going to school were lazy. They couldn't engage in agriculture. They couldn't keep livestock. That's why they have gone to school. So the same thing for these guys who were working. Most of the people who were doing some kind of very close jobs with the Europeans, coupled with the fact that the military guys now had to even come in and beat up the people and arrest the people and take away their things and impose these colonial policies that were seen as draconian as at the time by the people. So it was really not a very good image that was produced as at the time, which I think that image continued to stick even up to date, which is what we are talking about, still trying to change that ideology and that narrative and that perception amongst the people, seeing the military as their direct enemy, like an instrument of oppression, instrument of subjugation, not like security and that's instrument of nationalism and defense or whatever. So, but just like you said, that view was there. That view was there. It wasn't really that, yeah, these guys are doing well. So at some point it started changing. Don't get me wrong. At some point it started changing, just like we are saying. But some vestiges of it still stuck to that institution itself. And that is why you see, even during the First World War, and even the Second World War, the uh, Nigerian people who were, the Nigerian regiments who participated. You had a lot of Nigerians who participated in different campaigns, just like I've said, in German East Africa, participating in Tanzania and the rest. So you find them coming back and, bragging about what they did in the war front. And, at that point, it kind of started attracting people to want to be part of this institution. And just before then, people had still gotten attracted with the whole institution. But some vestiges of that this institution is for oppression is still there. It's still kept. It's still
I,
there.
I think you are right. Yeah, you're really you hit the nail on the head again. So when I see some soldiers here, and when I say here, I mean like in the West, and even
Yeah,
what you see on TV, there is a tendency for people to show love and pride in their soldiers.
yeah,
You're walking through a train station and someone sees a soldier and you're hearing things like, thank you for your service. They don't know the
yeah,
soldier. They're just, thank you so much for your service. That is just the way they feel. They see a soldier and they know that this is somebody who is putting down their life for the country. Like you've
yeah,
noted, it's like the highest form of sacrifice
yeah,
anybody can make for their country. But in Nigeria, that is not the case. People see soldiers and they are mostly afraid. But
yeah,
you've explained some of the history behind that. You've also pointed out that the impression was not always the same, that even in colonial times, there were Nigerians who were taking pride in the
mm-hmm,
fact that Nigerian soldiers were participating in the war on behalf
mm-hmm,
of the British. Now,
yeah,
growing up, I used to hear a lot about the role Nigerian soldiers played in Burma. We keep hearing Nigerians, fought in Burma, which was during the Second World War. But as we've just mentioned, there were also active participation, or there was also, excuse me, active participation from Nigerians in the First World War. So let's look at it, warfare in Nigeria from the geopolitical lens. What can you tell us about the engagement of our soldiers in global wars at the time, and also the local participation? So you were talking about pride of Nigerian community and how soldiers will come and describe their role in Burma. We're just talking about, I read in some newspapers during the Second World War, you know, in some
yeah,
archival newspapers, I mean, just to clarify, there was even a Nigerian Defense Fund that was set up. And so in different parts of the country, people were contributing money to this defense fund to be sent to Britain to support the war effort. You know, people will host plays, and the what they take at the gate from ticket sales would go towards the War Defense Fund, and dances and musical performances, things like that. So that does not support that whole idea of Nigerians were completely against the institution of colonialism or the British. It shows, in fact, that a lot of Nigerians were actively supporting Britain in the war, knowing that their sons and daughters, or their sons at least, and brothers or fathers were participating in this war. So what can you tell us from your research, about local, effect of the war, local participation, and all of that for, geopolitical conflicts that happened during colonial era?
okay, yeah. It's really interesting and really very important for you to have raised this, because it's part of a major discussion that have been going on about what warfare is all about, and where war starts and where it ends. And people really still continue to think that war is still all about the shooting and the killing, and that's it. So the First World War, which started from 1914 to 1918, the same colonial period, and even the second one, which still started from 39 to 45, the same colonial period. So the two world wars still happened between these two periods, within the colonial period that we are discussing. So you find that the two sides at war as at the time, the British on the one side and then the Germans on the other side, both of them had presence in Africa, right? And then their interest was to do what? Get as much as they could, muster those resources from Africa and then make use of them, exploit and win these wars, no matter what it takes. And propaganda really played a very good role in this. It played a very heavy role. So Africans were not Europeans. Their business was not ours, but because we were colonies, their business became ours. So somehow we became part of the war. So the British, as much as they could, tried to pump in their propaganda into their colonies, and the Germans as well did theirs, pushing and explaining to the people why they have to fight this war, why they have to support this war, why you have to, you know, give all you have to support the war. So, but at the end of the day, you find that the people had to support this war in terms of, on their colonial lines. So the uh, German colonies had to fight along German lines, and British colonies had to fight along British lines. So at the end of the day, you find that people give a lot of support. In fact, Professor Chima in the US also has written a book on Nigeria in World War II. So you find where Nigerians gave not just the people who fought the war, because we will just think about, oh, Nigerian regiment or Nigerian contingents fighting in Burma or Tanzania or Ethiopia, as the case may be, or the Cameroons. So, but these are people, right, who have gone to fight and to, the boots on ground, the soldiers who fought the war. But what of the people who kept the soldiers in the front? What of the people who made sure that these soldiers were eating? What of the people who made sure that these soldiers had boots to wear? What of the people who made sure that these soldiers had clothes to wear? You know, all these things came from the people. And because the people believed that they were part of the British Empire, they kept fighting. Like you have said, people wrote letters of support and solidarity to the British crown, saying, "Yeah, the king, we have always supported this crown and this whole thing, and everybody, the queen, and blah blah blah." A lot of people, everybody were writing letters, pledging support, saying, "Yeah, we are going to support with everything we have." But when the pangs of the whole support started, there were also a lot of complaints, which was the major part of Korea's book, because he had to get these petitions to begin to, look at how people complained during this war. Because the British had to, ration everything that were around. If you used to eat one mudu of gari, you have to. If you used to eat two, you have to start eating one. If you were buying lots of meat, you have to buy half of what you were buying and everything. So they just had to ration everything, including fuel, even vehicles. They had to just control everything, and people were not comfortable with that because it affected their own lifestyle. It changed everything they used to know. Like, no matter where you want to travel to, if you don't have enough fuel, you can't get there. Transportation was really affected. Feeding in every families, like it came to the doorsteps of people. But when we say Second World War, First World War, we only talk about what was happening in Europe, how German soldiers were shooting British soldiers and French soldiers and whatever. But we don't understand how people in Africa also fought these wars in their homes by the support that they give, and even the ones that they did not give, because the people at some point did not give some support that these policies brought to their own doorstep and made them not to feed well. People who went to the market, they fixed prices for them, made sure they did not sell above the fixed prices, and took people to court, jailed people, and because of profiteering, a lot of changes and a lot of happenings that occurred at the time was really how people experienced the world wars in Nigeria, and it wasn't really a very enjoyable one. In as much as you find it difficult to meet people who were alive, especially during the First World War. But the records and the complaints that were sent to the British authorities at the time will tell you some people were transporters who specialized in carrying goods for people, for traders, and people also operated warehouses, and they were told, like, controlled about how they will make use of their lorries, and their businesses kept collapsing. Many of them had to go out of business because of the war that they knew nothing about. But even at that, people still contributed monies in unions, as we have talked about, and took to the British authorities supporting the war effort. So, but the propaganda really tried because that was what made Africans believe that the war was theirs, right? They believed that if Germany should win this war and Britain loses this war, it's going to be a whole lot of barbarism released on the world. So we have to make sure that the British wins this war. So they gave every support that they had. They provided the men, they provided the resources, they provided everything that they could provide, and continue to produce because the British also made it as a policy, to produce those products that were needed for the war as at the time. Like even if you wanted to farm yam because you and your family will eat yam as at the time, it will make you to produce probably rice or beans, something that they will take to the soldiers in the front. So people had to sacrifice their own personal interest and also how they would survive, their own survival food for them to be able to support the war effort. So it really, really got to the people. And yeah, it was really it was really hard on the people, but they still did it with that sense of support and being part of the empire. And they kept saying, "Yeah, for king and for country," as Korea would put it.
No, you are right. I think propaganda generally is a big part of war,
Mm,
and it was deployed very well in the British colonies. Even outside of warfare, just making reference to the phrase you just used for king and for country, a lot of
mm,
programs that were aired on radio by the time radio was launched in the 40s
mm,
in colonial Nigeria, from mid 30s to the 40s and all of that. Most of the programs will start with the British anthem and end with "Long Live the King."
mm,
So this propaganda approach was very, very important in driving the loyalty of Africans. And just like you note, it's quite interesting that Africans ended up being pitched against one another in European wars. Even and the wars affected us. So if I think about the First World War, for instance, Nigeria is bordered on the east by Cameroon, which originally used to be a British territory, a German territory, excuse me.
mm,
And
mm,
so, yeah, that's what I meant to say, a German territory. And then when the war broke out, the British were in a hurry to conquer that place to avoid it becoming a stronghold from which Germans could come into their territory in Nigeria. So, and that is how the British Cameroons became established after the British used local forces under the command of the British to go and conquer Cameroons, and then we ended up having British Cameroons with places like Victoria, Buya, Bamenda, and what have you. So really interesting.
mm,
Yeah, a couple of other things I've seen that speak to how the war affected Africans locally or African activities, things like business communications that were affected because all of the country or the colonies were set on a war footing. So, as you've mentioned, transportation was affected, prices were affected, newspapers from the period have so many stories about people who were taken to court for selling above the prices that had been established, and this was affecting everybody. So there was
mm,
scarcity, there were price controls. Essentially, the war was happening in African homes, in Nigerian homes, but the history is incomplete because nobody talks about it. We only talk about for the history records that have been produced, how the war happened in Europe and
mm,
what different European countries and communities were doing during the
mm.
war. And this is why the work you're doing really excites me, moving a little more into the effects of warfare from both historical and current perspectives. I'm curious to know if there are any connections that can be drawn between warfare in the colonial era and nation building, especially in the build up to independence and then even in the post colonial era, with like the Nigerian Civil War and all of that. What kind of connections can be drawn between warfare and nation building?
Yeah, just like we have said before, it's in fact war itself and people who have made wars have always made wars with the aim of building nations. And truly, and just to be fair to warfare itself, has also built nations, just like it has destroyed nations. While it destroys nations, it builds nations. That Nigeria is still Nigeria today is still war, right? If not for the civil war, Nigeria would have not been like what it is today. And even the territory, also called Nigeria, was produced by war itself. So, in fact, it's all about history, making history, as Ray Azatia would write in her book, Times Monster. You find out that it's just a continuation of the history that has happened. It continues to, connect. And once that trend has started, once that trajectory has started, it has no end. You connect one to the other and it continues to move. So you find that just like wars started establishing most of these pre-colonial societies in Nigeria, warfare again came, destabilized the societies and created a different kind of society again by the colonials, right? Now they became a territory, on their own, started answering a country that they never accepted in the first place. It was created by war in the first place. Now, with that, they had to still continue to maintain this country and this territory with war again. And even during the period of colonial authorities or establishment or administration, you still find uprisings, riots, and protests that came up, and it was still doused by what we may call, probably protest control or, like you have said before, pacification. So, and after that, you still saw that a lot of pre-colonial or colonial history of Nigeria, a lot of happenings in the colonial period were what actually launched Nigeria in the post-colonial period into the civil war. Looking at a lot of things that happened, how we even got our independence, the whole ethnic divide that we had, and how we even entered into the military, and also how the military, still believing that, yeah, we can correct these things by changing the narrative, and eventually the country found itself in war. And whenever you still trace the origin, it goes back to the colonial period, because in the first place, these people never knew themselves as one, and war was used to keep them as one. And in the post-colonial period, that creation, that identity that has been created, in fact, from the understanding for me, which I really argued in one of my papers about this view of creating two different protectorates, right? Southern Nigeria and Northern Nigeria. It became a thing of almost like a competition, administered differently, almost like a competition. The way you say Ghana and Nigeria today, and they will always be at loggerheads. Yeah, Nigeria is doing better, Ghana is doing better. Like they have never seen themselves as one country. And tomorrow you lump them together and say both of you must be the same. That competition will continue no matter what you do. So at that point, Nigerians still continue to see themselves as being, different, identifying with these along these ethnic lines, and with this whole regionalism at the end that came in again. Western Nigeria, Northern Nigeria, Eastern Nigeria, these people were identified along these regional lines, and before you knew what was happening, it went to war. Now, you see that connection, that historical connection, going back even from the pre-colonial times up to the colonial periods, and then the post-colonial period, and then finding ourselves in the civil war. So it still remains there. I don't know the other question you asked. I can't remember what you asked in the second part of the question. So can
So I,
you?
I, wa- I was just curious about you answered the question already. I was curious
Yeah.
about the kind of connections that can be drawn between warfare in the colonial
Okay.
era and nation building. I think you already answered it, and you also shed some light on the effects, of warfare on nation building in the post-colonial era, referring
Yeah.
specifically to the Civil War. Unlike many other, well, not I won't say many other, but unlike some other former colonies of Europe in Africa, Nigeria can be considered to have had a relatively, if you like, peaceful transition from colonial rule to independence. Unlike a place like Algeria, where there was a big fight against the French, or a place like Kenya, where there was a Mau Mau rebellion and the British had to come down heavily on the locals. This was in the 1950s. In Nigeria, there seemed to be a lot more cooperation between our local political leaders and the British. So there was extensive, if you like, training, of locals in the art of administration. At least within the British structure, there were Nigerians who were very well positioned to take up the system of administration and move the country into the next phase of its history. That doesn't mean that there were no incidents that required some kind of suppression, or pacification. For example, if you think about the colliery incident in Enugu in 1949, when there was a miners' strike, and then some miners ended up dying, because the police shot at them. There was a general uprising, and mining was a key part of industry in the southeast at the time. And so the government had to send soldiers down there to go and put the place on lockdown, that kind of thing. So all of these were incidents that local leaders galvanized opinion around to try to push the British for independence. And from some of the things I've read in archival papers from the 40s, like the mid 40s, after the Second World War, going into the 50s, you have leaders like Zik frequently referring, by Zik, I mean Nnamdi Azikiwe, who are not, for people who are not familiar with who Zik was. So you have people like Nnamdi Azikiwe writing to the British and referencing the role of Nigerians in wars like the Second World War to say, we have sacrificed ourselves for you to uphold, your ideals as a nation. It is time for you to pay back and give us our nation. We want to be the ones in charge of Nigeria. And so, in a sense, indirectly, it occurred to me that participation in that war, the Second World War, was a platform for nation building in the eyes of people like Zik. And then things like the cholera incident, which may not have been a war exactly, but had the characteristics of a war in terms of using soldiers to suppress, local reaction to what they considered colonial oppression, was also another, way nation, a sense of nationalism was, fostered amongst the people, by Nigerian political leaders. And all of that, like you mentioned, builds up into the civil war and what have you. So yeah, thanks for that. I'm curious to also know if there are any links that can be made between warfare in colonial times and the kind of security challenges Nigeria faces today, whether this is from a strategic or tactical perspective or any other perspective, as a matter of fact. So, what can we learn from our history of warfare that is relevant for today?
Yeah, well, you may not basically look at it from the colonial perspective, but really from the post-colonial perspective, like most of the issues that we have in terms of insecurity today, in as much as we connect everything, like the foundation of all our problems to colonialism, because we can't just do away with that. That is the history that has been given to us, and we can't do anything about it. So, at the end of the day, most of the problems that we have, issue of resource control and the rest that keeps coming up, you can't just do away with the colonial background that everything has, which again launched us into the civil war, which kind of produced most of the insecurity, other insecurity issues that we have in terms of look at crime rate and the rest, which so had so much after the war, which I don't know, maybe we'll still talk about that aspect, but then we'll still go into that if we go into that, looking at
We certainly can. If you want to shed some light on it, that's fine.
The impact that the war itself left on society, which is characteristic of all wars. that is the ugly aspect of it, the ugly face of war. Because when you look at, yeah, creating society, creating that nation, you now look at what it actually left after it has created it. That Nigeria is one today, yes, achieved by war, but at the end of the day, what is left of that Nigeria, and what did war do to that Nigeria, to that Nigerian project that we built with war, right? What is left of it?
Okay,
So
I like that you raised this issue. If we're talking about the Civil War and how
yeah,
that has, what impact it has had from, say, even if the objective of those who were prosecuting the war on the Nigerian side was to retain the nation as a nation and not
yeah,
let Biafra break away, what
yeah,
has actually happened of that Nigeria project? So,
yeah,
if you can address that, I would like it from your view as a historian, but
yeah.
also add to that. I'm curious to know how has warfare or that particular war affected the practice of history in your view as a historian. So are there political considerations that have affected the profession of history? For instance, if we're speaking about this Biafran war, did it have any impact on the way we teach history? Can you illustrate, like, and what approach would you recommend for the teaching of public history that, maybe shares as many perspectives as possible without creating sociopolitical rancor, such that people can begin to appreciate this project Nigeria as it is, the concept of nationalism, nationhood? I feel like it's all part of a piece. So over to you to respond to that however you like.
Yeah, so history on its own, like generally, has faced a lot of issues. This particular problem that we have mentioned, the practice and also the teaching of history, has been a major issue. Like the way people have seen history, the way people have appreciated history in Nigeria, is really a big problem. And that is why we still have that issue of understanding what our problem is in the country. You see a lot of people believing in the wrong ways of correcting ills, right? So it's not just about the war itself, but the way we have appreciated history in general in Nigeria. That is a problem. In as much as, yes, when the war happened, it also injected a different narrative to our history. People studying the Civil War, looking at different aspects of it, diplomatic aspect of the Civil War, women's experiences in the Civil War, the operational aspect of it, the social aspect of it, even humanitarian intervention in the war. There are different aspects that have come in terms of historical study of the war. But then the question is, how does it now impact the life of the people? Because the people really don't know these things, which is where the problem comes in, right? And that is why I have said I like what you are doing, because I think this is where people mostly watch these things, because these things are left in books. And most people wouldn't still, some may not be literate enough to read, and some people will not want to leave whatever they are doing to do these readings, because it takes time for you to read as well. So it's really the way people have looked upon history without thinking that there is something important to learn from past events. If we had been learning from that past events, we will understand, why whatever that is happening today is happening. You will now understand why you shouldn't do some particular kind of things, because these things have been done and they failed. People still believe so much in using violence to solve some kind of things. Today, we still have this whole Biafra movement of people believing we have to fight, we have to do this, we have to do that, without actually clear plans, right? So, and at the end of the day, if you start any war without a clear plan, you're going to fail at the end of the day. And that is what many people have still been pushing for. And it is really, people, it is really, when I went to the field to conduct some interviews, I was really surprised about the level of ignorance in the people about the war, amongst the people, right? Apart from people who saw the war, who experienced it, who fought this war, the next generation, seems to be so uninterested even about what happened. And they don't know what happened, and they're not even interested in knowing. So at the end of the day, they feel they have no connection to that. It doesn't matter what happened. What they are looking at is what is going to happen in the future, without understanding that what happened in that past is what is going to guide you in creating that future for yourself. But we just many people feel it's not important. Nothing happened then was oh that this happened and so right. So but you don't understand why the southeast is the way it is today. Looks like a war zone, right? And what really happened in that war? A lot of stories have come up, a lot of myths about how Biafra lost the war and how the federal troops won the war without even asking questions about what is true and what is not true, which is really where we need to come in, like to educate the people, to make the people understand what happened and why those things happened and why we need to, solve our problems differently and not to invite some kind of violence, right? And even the federal side too, even the politicians themselves also need to understand some kind of grievances that are being held by people to address these things differently, like the power of commemoration, teaching the people the history of the war, making the people understand why it happened and why it should not happen again. Because as it stands right now, a lot of people still feel that, oh, the war should repeat itself, right? And that is where people are driving to because they do not understand what happened, why it happened, and why it shouldn't happen again. They still believe there are reasons for it to happen now again, right? Which is really very appalling when you listen to people. And the same thing that we're talking about, people having a very poor sense of what warfare is all about. The same issue about people thinking, just like what the colonial Nigerians thought us at the time, that the World War and the support they gave was not going to affect them in any way. It was just going to be about letter writing and people that they will send to the front. They never knew that their gare and their beans and their rice was going to be involved. They never knew that, their prices of their goods will be involved. They never knew that their lorries, they never knew that their warehouses were going to take hits from the war. So that is why when we begin to understand how wars are fought and what it brings, that is when we'll have to think twice before, opting for that option of war or like going for war. Because it goes beyond that. After the shootings and the killings, what happens to a people that are under occupation? Even during the world wars in Europe as well, it is not just peculiar to Africa. When wars happen, a lot of negativities, a lot of bad things happen. And when a people come under occupation during war, it changes the landscape. It affects, when we talk about affecting everything, it's like everything in the real sense of everything. Even the land on which you march changes because there are going to be lots of trenches that are going to be dug in different areas. There are going to be lots of military hardwares that are going to be abandoned after the war.
Landmines too and things like that.
Landmines and things like that, and people will go to the bush to burn their own lands, and bullets will explode and kill people. And you will find bombs in people's farms after the war. This is after the war, right? Everything has finished, like, and people are still dying from that. And this is what people really don't think about when they think about warfare. They think after the whole, physical combat and whatever engagement, fire and return the fire, and that's it. Everybody goes home and we sleep, and that's it. But a lot of things must change. Even your culture will change, your traditions, your local institutions. A lot of local institutions, traditional institutions in southeastern Nigeria lost their prestige during the war. People stopped respecting these institutions because the federal troops came in and became the new institutions, the new authorities, and decided when people would go to the market, in fact, closed down a lot of markets. Some markets stopped existing because of the war. Some new
Yes.
ones came up. People imbibed militaristic lifestyle because of the war. And after that war, they continued to rob their fellow citizens. They continued to kill people. A lot of people got pregnant, women got pregnant, gave birth to children that they didn't know where their father was. So then a lot of things would continue to happen. And imagine young girls, as at the time, probably a girl is 14 and the war starts, and she gets pregnant and gives birth probably at the age of 15 or 16.
Yes.
That that girl's life automatically has changed for the rest of her life. it is not a case of, yeah, the war has ended. The war has ended, but she's still at war. And she will continue to
Yes.
be at war for the fact she continues to see that child and she continues to raise that child.
Mm.
So a lot of things that really affect the people, we are the things that are not really being talked about when war is
Yeah.
discussed, right? So you talk about healthcare system, that you get sick and you go to the hospital doesn't happen when you are at war, right? If you are really at war, you don't get sick and go to the hospital. You get sick, it's either you die or you survive and nothing else. You don't have to go to the hospital. There were cases and instances where people had to, one of the informants that I met in the field during my interviews said that they met a woman who was pregnant and she was in labor, but because they were on a mission, they were part of the Vietnam Rangers, as you may call them. They met the woman in labor. She was there sitting by the tree, and she said the woman probably couldn't give birth normally. She needed an operation, a cesarean section, and she died there. On their return from wherever they went to, they saw the woman like after 1 month. They saw the carcass of the person sitting there, the same thing, and the person died. And these are things that people don't think about. They think at the end of the day, when war happens, it's just about that same shooting. But these are the kind of things we talk about sanitation, right? People, you go to the rivers to fetch water, you see dead bodies floating there, right?
Mm.
There is no longer rules about how people will defecate, how people will bathe, and how people will eat or whatever. People will,
Yes.
we are familiar with a lot of experiences of the people during the Civil War. People ate rats, ate lizard, ate raw cassava, and all kinds of things. And
Mm-hmm.
these are the aspects of war that we still don't look at. Okay, it's about shooting. It's not just about shooting. In fact, the major suffering comes to the people, to their homes, because whatever you have will be destroyed. And you leave your homes, you forget your education, you forget your life. There were people who were in secondary school when the war started. There were people who were in the university when the war started. There were people who were planning to get married when the war started. There were young men who were taken away from their homes to go and fight and they never came back. There are parents who lost all their male children because of the war. Like, these are people who continue to fight that war and like continues to impact and it continues to extend. It doesn't end at the end of the day because whenever you look back, you still see different vestiges of the war. Like um, this guy in Europe who wrote about uh, the legal aspect of Biafra during the war.
Yeah.
He, so the guy really talked about how even the issue of internet fraud that we're facing today also can be linked to the issues of the world. Today, internet fraud has transformed so much in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if it is still a crime or now a way of life. So it has become so common. Like people now even say it openly and brag about it that yes, I'm a Yahoo boy. But when we look at it from today's perspective, we don't know that it has a history, which by the time you look at it again, you see where it is coming from, products of war, which we
Mm.
don't know,
How is
right?
this? I'm really curious about this one particular thing. Can you just maybe draw that line you are referencing, the connection between internet fraud and warfare in Nigeria?
Yeah, so when during the Civil War, right, now a lot of institutions broke down. Everything went down. Nothing was working because it was a war situation. And in war situations, anything goes. Now, many people had to survive by criminal tendencies, like different criminal ways of living. That was
Mm-hmm.
how people had to survive. For you to move around, you needed some kind of documentation or whatever. And sometimes when you want to get to the federal authorities to get something, you have to get some documents and whatever. So people had to even do a lot of forgery, right? To kind of get what they needed. So people needed to also dupe their fellow citizens or whatever you may call them to
Mm-hmm.
be able to survive. There were people who had to con their neighbors. take away their belongings by false pretense and all have you.
Yes.
And these were the origins of trying to, you know, take something away from someone by false pretense. So before you knew what was happening in the post-war period, that same trend continued. A lot of people still continue to try to, by false pretense and forgery and conning and all sorts of names, get things that they were not supposed to get. And from there, it became a way of living. Even the same thing with robbery. We have seen the way robbery has transformed over time. If you look at even the history of southeastern Nigeria and how at some points there were times when it was highway robbery that was the in thing.
Yes.
People will stand by the roadside with their rifles and stop buses and rob people and kill some people. And tomorrow you hear it on another highway. Later they left the highway, came to the streets, they started robbing home to home. But with the coming of banking, the new banking system, people were not keeping monies at home anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So the home to home robbery had to go. Now it has to transform to going to rob banks now.
Mm.
At some point, it seems as if once you rob the bank, they will catch you. They now have to go to kidnapping. And many people have also connected even the incidents of kidnapping to even issues of the Civil War because they kept saying that kidnapping was not known until the Civil War came. And it came with the fact that most federal troops would take, some of these Biafran, they call them Ojuku boys. They will take these boys, they term the Ojuku boys,
Mm-hmm.
take them to their base, and then ask their people to pay ransom for them to release them back to them. So, some scholars have tied that to the origin of kidnapping in the country, and it's just a way of taking people, and then people now had to take that as an idea that we can do this and get money, right? So it's it's kind of some of these things you wouldn't know that they are happening, but they would subtly happen, like transform and continue to move. And just like what happened even during the First World War, how women became part of the society, started working and the rest because of the war. The plan was
Mm.
not to make women work, but the war took men to the war front.
Mm-hmm.
Then most of these nations, Britain, France, they had to take women to the industries to produce
Yes.
even the weapons that will be used. And that
Yes.
was how women said, oh, wow, this is interesting. We are not living this work anymore. Even
Mm-hmm.
though many of them went back, people thought the change had not happened, any transformation
Mm.
had not happened. But before you knew what was happening, you found women, it even also inspired the whole suffragette movement about women's
Yes.
and the rest and the rest. These things will happen and they are interconnected. But people will think, yeah, people who are agitating for women's right to vote are different from people who were working in
Mm.
industries, and it is different from why women are now asking for equality and all these things. So
Yes.
people connected these things lead, this one will lead to this one will lead to this one will lead to that, and it will continue to transform. And today we have found ourselves, because when you now have new equipment and new tools and modernity continues to change the kind of technology we have, those things will also continue to change because even we know that even when internet came newly, that it was basically just sending of mails. That was where the Yahoo boy came from, right? Because it was
Mm-hmm.
Yahoo, they send mails to people and then convince them that they want to do business or want to marry them or whatever, and then they send money to them, and it was being called Yahoo. So
Mm-hmm.
because these things have continued to change now, internet has gotten to everybody's home. That was when we had what do you call it, cyber cafes and the rest. That's where police will go raid to get these boys and then take them to their stations. But now
Mm-hmm.
it's no longer there is even no cyber cafes anymore, just in
Yes.
a different way. So these things will continue to transform. Tomorrow, the Yahoo boys themselves don't even know where their history started from. Right.
Mm.
So, and it makes them to think that it is not crime that they are committing because it has become something they feel is a survival strategy. Yeah, we have to survive, so we have to do something. So it's all
I like the illustrations you've given. You've made so many points that make me remember a lot of the things I've seen in my own research. I can mention a couple of things. For example, one relating to fraud has to do with how people started to represent themselves as soldiers in the
Yeah.
aftermath of the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And so the military authorities, the colonial government, frequently in the newspapers, I'm talking about like 1946 and going on, they will
Mm-hmm.
continuously publish notices in the papers about how employers can identify people who are former soldiers. Because
Mm-hmm.
just the same way veterans are given preference in most part of the world, this was also
Mm-hmm.
happening in the aftermath of the Second World War. So people who had gone to fight, Nigerians who had gone to fight, in the war would come back and they were supposed to be given preference in terms of employment. And so the government will regularly publish notices in the paper to tell employers how they can identify anybody who's trying to defraud them by presenting themselves as soldiers. They say you have to
Mm-hmm.
ask for their discharge certificate, and there were a couple of other documents that everybody who was a soldier in that war has to present. And on the basis
Mm-hmm.
of that, your chances of getting employed are better than somebody else who didn't fight in the war. But then
Yeah.
people realizing that this was going on would now go and pose as soldiers. So that is fraud,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the government
Yeah.
now had to try to stand against that and say, if anybody is telling you that they were a soldier in the war, ask them for this, this, and this. And
Mm-hmm.
upon employment, send their details to us so that we can check against our register, and confirm to you that they really. So it was a two-step process. You need to check for this first, and when you
Mm-hmm.
employ them, please send the information to us. I think that also helped the government to get a sense of how many of their former soldiers were now in paid employment and
Mm-hmm.
getting on with life in the society. The
Mm-hmm.
other example I want to give has a maybe similar economic connection. So after the Second World War, prices were high in Nigeria, wages were low, and people, were unable to afford the daily goods of life in spite of the price rationing. So there was pressure from everywhere. The people who were selling were saying, look, you can't continue to manage our prices because it's affecting our profitability. But
Mm-hmm.
again, there was shortage of rations, and then
Mm-hmm.
the general people generally, the population were not happy. So a general strike was
Mm-hmm.
called. And the point I'm just trying to make with that is even after a war, the war continues. Just
Yeah.
like you mentioned earlier, it doesn't end with the shooting or the
Mm-hmm.
truce that is called. A lot of, reverberation continues. A lot of
Mm-hmm.
implication continues to affect the people for a long time afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
I have just two more questions for you, and then we can anchor. So,
Mm.
as a historian, what kind of sources do you generally rely on, and what kind of sources do you wish you had access to? And in addition to that, what is your general approach to the practice of history? So, for example, does oral history have any relevance?
Yeah. In fact, history, I don't know how to explain the relevance of oral history, but its relevance is enormous. The only way for me, what I think, for people to understand that history has this human aspect of it, because for for every history that we give as historians, people see them as stories. They find it very, very difficult to connect to these histories as actually lived experiences of their fellow human beings. And that is why history continues to get this pushback that it gets of, yeah, so what is my business with what happened in 1966? Right? So, because people still find it very difficult to connect to those happenings. Now, the only way that they connect to it is when you begin to make them have the feeling of what really happened. They now begin to say, oh, so this was what happened, right? That is the only time they begin to connect to it. During my oral interview with one of my informants then about the Civil War as well, his son, the man was talking to me about what happened during the war. And basically, because I was interviewing him about the soldiers and the young girls in the society and how these federal troops, coerced some of the married women involved as well to also live with them, conjugal slavery, and a lot of forced marriages and what have you. So the man was telling me about those things. And the son was inside the house listening to what he was telling me. Later, the son came out and said, Daddy, you never told us about these things. Why didn't you mention these things to us? And he said, I've been saying it, nobody has listened to me before, right? And it's because he identified with the story differently when the man was saying it as just, well, so what is my business with what happened? But at the time, he started giving instances of people that the guy knows, right? He knows this family. Their father was killed during this time because he was trying to stop the soldiers from taking their mother, and this person was given some kind of beatings because of so and so. That was when he was able to connect to that. So I think oral history has a lot of relevance to play. It has a lot of role to play in terms of connecting the people to have that human connection and feelings to what happened in the past, different from the kind of feeling that written evidence and documents may bring, because
Yes.
just like the argument that has been going on today about sources that we use and how to decolonize these sources, because it is basically the documents of the Europeans left, right? So how do we now begin to take out what is important to us and leave what is not important to us, and also to say this is what the white man said about you? Is this what? How do you interpret that? Just like for me now in my field, to answer your question again about the wars of conquest in southern Nigeria now, you get these sources about probably letters and some kind of um, orders given to these troops in written forms and whatever. These things are still not going to cover these aspects that we have been discussing about, right? What happened to the people? How did the people react? What did the people think? How did it affect the life of the people? Europeans are only going to record, yeah, we conquered this place, we were able to take over this place, and this was it, and that's it. Like, that's it. So, what of the people? How did it affect them? What do they think about this? What happened? Like, how do they react? What It's no longer what they are interested in telling you, and that is the source
Mm,
you have. If you had people who now lived during that period, that is when you are going to understand how they felt, how it changed their life, how it affected them. Even the people who fought in those wars that died, because the Europeans are going to tell you that they killed 20 Africans. They are not going to tell you who and who and who are those 20 Africans, but they
mm,
are going to tell you how many Europeans and their names that died, right? So these
exactly.
are the lapses that we have about just depending on those written European documents, which are just what we have now, and not even that we have them, that they are even easily available and everywhere. You still have to go
Mm,
to the archives in the UK to begin to source for them. I looked for some of these documents in Nigerian archives and I couldn't find any relevant one, because many of the documents, it's because it's a military affair, I believe. Probably, maybe they didn't leave a lot of them behind. They had to take some of them out. So a lot of things that have happened, like even these trials that happened and people they hanged and why they hanged them, and so these things are really important to the history of what really happened the time these wars of conquest happened in Nigeria. So for me, I think oral history is really important. If we had an access or a way to get it, right, it would really help, especially for my research. If I had some kind of oral history that I can leverage on to get, some other aspects of what really happened, it will really go a long way in balancing what I will get from the UK archives and probably other published documents and some other unpublished works, the research that have been done on that aspect. So, but for now, I just hope to get, documents from, colonial documents, probably from War Office, Colonial Office, and then war diaries from some of these commanders and, officers and personnel, European officers and personnel that served in these areas. So yeah, and even correspondences as well, between some of these commanders and then the colonial secretary and all those or colonial authorities as at the time, because they kept sending back reports to what they did and the stage of their operations and what they're
Mm.
going to do next. And then these authorities will send back the next agenda or operation or order of what to do, and then they will still do what they can and still send back their report. So from these, you may be able to get some idea of what really happened, what really transpired between the people and uh, the Europeans that went into these wars of conquest at the time.
Well, wow, you really covered you've covered the ground very well there. I like how you emphasized the importance of oral history, and I couldn't agree with you more about how sometimes recorded history, like documents, can be biased.
Mm,
As you were speaking, I remembered reading an article in a newspaper published in the 50s then about the Mau Mau War in Kenya when the locals were fighting for independence. And the way this reporter covered the story was quite interesting because he described the locals as terrorists. And I've read some other literature that describes the actions of the locals as terrorists. In
mm,
fairness, there were some atrocities that were committed by
mm,
the Mau Mau as they were fighting for their own independence.
mm,
They killed some locals or chiefs who they thought were working with the British. But the British were also very guilty of committing a lot of atrocities, even more than the locals. But the British were not described as
mm-hmm,
terrorists.
yeah,
And instead of describing the locals as freedom fighters, or at least people who might have used um, unsavory methods to fight for their independence, they were described as terrorists. And this is how they were described to people in other colonies, including in Nigeria and Lagos, And of course, there were graphic descriptions of how the British treated these terrorists, in quotes.
mm-hmm,
So it leaves one to wonder if such descriptions were not intended to influence any other potential independence movements across the empire to be aware of what would happen to them when the British
mm-hmm,
come to them, but also to give them um, like make them want to separate themselves from people who are terrorizing the empire, so to speak.
mm-hmm,
So all those kind of sources have an influence on how people look at history. I'm sure the Mama at the time didn't think about themselves as terrorists. They were thinking about
yeah,
themselves as independence fighters who
mm-hmm,
wanted to be independent. But
mm-hmm,
this recorded history doesn't give them that benefit. It calls them terrorists. And
mm-hmm,
things like oral history play a big role in giving us multidimensional perspectives on
mm-hmm,
history. I think another thing that is useful are things like artifacts,
mm-hmm,
cultural production, our music, our stories, all of these are sources, even our literature that we can tap into to get a sense of how people of a particular era view themselves within the
mm-hmm,
colonial context and what have you. So I appreciate that clarification
yeah.
which you gave. One final question from me, and you may have referenced this already, but I'll let you respond how you want. What can our military history tell us about our history as a people? For instance, in the course of your research, what are some of the things you've learned about Nigeria or its people and its culture that is not common knowledge, but has come to your knowledge as a result of studying military history?
Well, just like every other branch of history, military history on its own, because the way we've been discussing war, it looks like, yeah, military history is just about shooting and killing. So there are still other aspects of it. It covers everything that has to do with conflict, right? So if it is even war and society, like we have talked about the impact, there are people who still specialize in what war has, the changes that war brought, and the impact war left on people and such aspects. But some people also specialize in the operational aspects of it, the shooting and all this and all that. So, but really coming to what you may say that I've picked from military history and how maybe what let's start with how it has how it will help people. I don't know how you put that question, but somehow about how it connects to the history of the people in
Yeah, just
general.
what like
Yeah,
anything unique, that
yeah,
you've learned. So I can give an example of something that comes to mind, and this may not even necessarily have to do with Nigeria, but it
yeah.
flashed through my mind as you were speaking a few moments ago. So I've read some literature somewhere where a historian, I'm not sure of his name now, it might be DK, but I can confirm that. But
Mm-hmm,
one argument he was making in this paper I read is that prior to the First World War, which was from
yeah.
1914 to 1918, as you noted,
Mm-hmm,
um, the staple root crop in Nigeria was yam, but today
mm-hmm,
it is cassava.
mm-hmm,
And the point he was making is that some of the points he was making, if I can remember correctly, is that after the First World War, that was when we had the Spanish influenza incident. That Spanish flu manifested in Nigeria as a result of soldiers who came back from the war, both Nigerian and foreign British soldiers who came back, ships who were docking in Nigeria, and it traveled into the country that way.
mm-hmm,
So in addition to the fact that the war, um, you know, affected manpower, and reduced the number of men available to farm yams at the time
yeah,
because yam was seen as a male crop, what men were
yeah,
farming, while cassava was seen as a female crop that women
yeah.
were primarily farming. And so, if I remember his argument correctly, it was something along the lines of, first of all, the war reduced available manpower to produce yams agriculturally, which gave cassava like a front footing. But then the influenza now came and devastated, families as well, reducing population. And so there were now even still fewer people to farm yams. And as a result of, these two incidents coinciding or converging, um,
Mm-hmm,
people had to turn to cassava, as to survive versus yams that they used to farm. And I know that in certain societies, maybe in the south, it's like the Ozo society, they may not eat cassava because it is not acceptable for certain kinds of people to eat cassava. They have to eat yam, or even if
mm-hmm,
they eat cassava quietly in the privacy of their homes for certain kinds of occasions and
mm-hmm.
events, they would not eat cassava. So all of that just connects to how these kind of incidents can have an impact on society. So I was just curious if there was anything you've just stumbled upon, like a revelation, like wow, something that gave you much more clarity about our country, our people, our culture, that can be traced directly to the outcome of warfare in Nigeria from any kind of war at all.
Yeah, so that's interesting because like I have said, there are many which just the only problem I have is that you may say it is not common knowledge, but some people may still know about these things, just that it is just like you've called it common knowledge, not known by many. Like this is like Nigeria got independence in 1960. Yeah, everybody knows that. So,
Mm-hmm.
but it is interesting that there are many changes, just like I have said, that have been engendered by warfare in Nigeria. People may think about Nigeria, even just like I've said before, looking at warfare as just an instrument of destruction without even looking at it as also building, right? The war is also used to build, that you can also use war instead of destabilizing to stabilize, right? So, but it is looked as just destabilizing tool, but it also can be used to stabilize. So, this is one thing that I realized in after coming in contact with the look of things like the study of war over time. You now understand that it also impacts and changes the society drastically. There is nowhere that war touches that remains the same. You may not know, you may not notice it, but it is those impacts, they remain there. In fact, just the way I told you about how war really impacted the feminist movement, that's First World War itself, impacted feminist movements, is one thing people of today may not really reckon with. They may think that feminist movement just started yesterday, like, you know, looking at the meaning of feminism and the achievements that women and this issue of women rights have really made over time. You will tie it to changes that were brought by First World War, and as well some kind of uh, um, changes that you also find in our own cultures in Nigeria that you would see that came from different kind of wars that have been fought in different areas, even our own civil war. A lot of things changed. People, you will see some kind of institutions like sacred food that people never ate in the past, that people started eating because the war made the people to understand that, yeah, people can eat it and nothing will happen. Because there were some communities who said nobody should eat fish from this river. And soldiers came and ate the fishes in this river because they had nothing else to eat and they didn't
Mm.
die. So, and nothing happened. People were
Yes.
like, okay, so wow, interesting. It means nothing can happen. And, a lot of our institutions, like I told you, the institutions that were revered in the past before the war now lost some kind of, prestige because of people were not saw that this institution really did not have that kind of power to protect us or to do or whatnot. And, you know, even some people also in the Igbo land, when you talk about the caste system known as Osu caste system, right? You hear about people who became Osu because of the war, because they ran to a particular deity or shrine to protect them, and from there they became the property of the deity.
Mm.
So there are lots of changes and cultures that really got affected because of this same war that people may not really know what really happened. A man was saying that people started having issues with, just like what we have today about Port Harcourt, right? And this identification with the Igbo or not, right? Changing names because of the war, the product of the war. Yeah, we are not Igbo anymore. We have changed our names and all these and whatever, whatever, whatever. A lot of people still do not know why that thing is there, right? A lot of people also know. But even people who know as well sometimes get the wrong version of the whole thing and they begin to attack some people and say, yeah, these guys are bad people. They were the saboteurs of the past and what have you. And some people really who never did anything wrong are still being accused wrongly till date because of issues of the war. So there are a lot of things that you will find in that war that really, people don't know about and how people survived and what actually war was as at the time people were fighting it. Because people still also look at the Nigerian Civil War with the same views or the same perception they have about modern warfares of today. They look at jet fighters and how they move and they shoot, blah 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 blah, blah, and they feel, oh, this was not how it was happening as at the time.
Mm.
They don't really understand what it was for people to drop ordnances as at the time, like the kind of guns that were being used and all those stuff. Even the issue of how would they survive and what would they eat, how was it produced, what of the women, what was their role. So these things are really not what people really know, and actually the way to think about warfare as well, and how it affects everybody. So these different aspects are what I would say. But for me, the major thing for me is the fact that the society is surprisingly a product of war, and then the the society as well makes war. So people really think that war is not part of the society, but almost all aspects of our life is just has been modified and created. And even today, the world order is just about war. The product of the Second World War is what we have today as the world order, and the US making decisions, and look at what is happening in Israel and Palestine, and war, nothing. Produced by Second World War, and it has continued to be there, right? And even after the whole thing, look at Iran again attacking, and you go back, it's still all about products of war and vestiges of war and the impact of war, nothing else. But today, you see people talking about politics and international relations as if they are different from just discussions around war and its products and its impacts, and that's it.
I
Yeah.
wonder if a historian of peace, if a pacifist will agree with you. And I'm not saying you are wrong, but I'm just curious about, how different professionals have different perspectives about this kind of phenomenon. But I think you really answered the question very well. I like a lot of the points you make about pacifism being something that can actually be achieved as a function of war. So I think even if you didn't say that specifically, you've indirectly made that point very clear. And sometimes it is arguable that the prospect of war can be enough reason for people to choose peace. So you hear of countries talking about nuclear deterrence or having just the other people knowing that, look, if we try to fight, there is a risk of us not surviving. So let's just go with peace as our pathway. It's really, really interesting. But I totally agree with you. Warfare is inextricably linked with our history. Even this weekend alone, some Yoruba nation activists, if you may have seen the news, tried to take over the Oyo State House of Assembly. They were dressed in military gear and what have you, but they were subdued by the Nigerian soldiers. And so that just shows you how integrated the military and warfare is with anything that we can think about as as the existence of our nation or the survival of this democracy that we're trying to build.
Yeah.
Ozinna, I want to thank you very much for sharing your insights with me on Nationhood Podcast. I feel like we can talk so much more about your work, and I would like to invite you to the podcast again sometime soon so you can tell us some more about what is going on with your research.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's also a pleasure to have this conversation with you as well. It's really a good one. Like, it was an interesting session to have this conversation with you. So I really thank you for that. And anytime you invite me, I will be really ready and happy to have this chat again with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So, friends, that's our show for today. My guest was Ozinna Ntukogu, a lecturer of history and war studies at the Nigerian Defense Academy. Ozinna is also a doctoral researcher at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. If you enjoyed the show, please like, share, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. I have a few more interviews lined up for you, so stay tuned and thank you for watching. See you next time.